Dr. Wesley Leonard is our next speaker. He's a graduate of here at Miami University. He spent several years out at the University of California at Berkeley. And Wesley and my family have worked very closely together in understanding more intimately how language and how children internalize language, how they use language, how language affects things like identity. And so his dissertation was on that topic, and maybe he'll share a little bit about that. But all of that spills over into our programs and the kinds of information that we glean from our programs. So it's important for us to not only have language and cultural education programs, but to learn from those programs so we can continually make them better. And that's one of the main things that Dr. Leonard does, is through his research, he helps us continue to improve upon our techniques and programs. So, Dr. Leonard.
Good afternoon. Ironically enough, a good part of my presentation has to do with food. That seems to happen. So ostensibly, a report on the A1 Zapata language camp. And I'll be defining what that means, also telling you about the camp throughout the presentation. So I'm not going to do that right away. And as Daryl's told you, I'm a graduate of Miami University. It'll be 10 years this May, which makes me about 24. And I've been out in California at the University of California, Berkeley, for a number of years now, first as a PhD student, then as a PhD candidate, and finally as an unpaid lecturer, so it's all coming from the But I'm very pleased to be here today to talk to all of you about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. So to give you a little overview of what I'll be talking about this afternoon, first I'd like to give some brief background to the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma language camps, to sort of situate the larger context of what I'll be talking about. Secondly, I think that this question is one that's been present throughout all the presentations, both with the initial gatherings last night and for the viewing of the documentary, which some of you were a part of, and finally all of today, the question of why. And also, what is the larger context in which the A1 Zapata, which is the name of our language camp, what is the larger context in which that camp exists, that program? And finally, I'll be talking about the objectives of the A1 Zapata summer program, as well as some selected findings. But to give you some background, I know for some of you this will be old news because you were participating in these things. The Miami language camps, what we might call camps, and I put camps in quotation marks because in fact we're talking about a number of different initiatives. They're only camps in a very limited basic sense, or an educational program that exists on multiple levels. In any case, we started calling these camps. And they began a little over 10 years ago, at least in Oklahoma, several years before that in Indiana, similar language efforts. Importantly, in the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma then, the Administration for Native Americans, ANA grant, I believe was in 1996, or right around that time. From that, developed a series of short annual language workshops over a period of years, and in fact continuing to this day, usually 2 days or perhaps 3 days. Not an overnight program, but rather something where people would gather during the day, the idea being to learn a bit of language and then to be able to pass that on to others. Initially, and very importantly, these camps, these events, focused on language mastery for purposes of teaching. That is, a lot of the specific goals revolved around language specifically, language proficiency, the ability to say certain things, for example. And these are quite fun. This is from June 2004. The Miami children was at our tribal longhouse, west of Commerce, Oklahoma. You may recognize some of them. In fact, some of them are here, although they're not as young. Seems to happen to the rest of us. Myaamia skits, here they are talking on the Achimwakane. It's our word for telephone, the thing for talking, thing for relating information. Children a few years ago were rehearsing for Little Red Riding Hood, or I should say the Myaamia version of Little Red Riding Hood, in which we asked the question, who's afraid of the big bad fox? Of course, the big bad wolf is an appropriate figure in certain cultures, but not really in Miami. It's Mahoiwa, wolf. does not play that role, but fox definitely does. Papangamwa, if you're not careful, you will be outfoxed by the fox character. So here they are rehearsing for that. And of course, the skit itself was in the Miami language. There's some others you may recognize playing the moccasin game. These last few images have focused on children. Of course, elders always have and continue to play an important role in all of our language efforts. Anything that happens to be called a camp, anything that happens to be called a program, basically anything that has to do with language, period. Here on the left here is Mildred Walker, our oldest Myaamia elder, who is teaching us about the ninjik, about milkweed, which ones to pick, how to harvest them, and then of course we ate them later. So that's a brief overview to those short programs, those 2 to 3 day workshops that continue to this day. But what I'm primarily talking about this afternoon are the larger scale A1 Zapata camps, or A1 Zapata summer programs. In June of 2005, that's 3 years ago, wasn't a math major. In June of 2005, we had our first full-fledged week-long overnight language and culture program sponsored by the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, and this is for Miami youth ages 10 through 16. More of the participants falling toward the earlier end of that, so 10, 11, 12, 13, and so on. And that program then became an annual program, with the second and third A1 Zapata programs happening in June of 2006, and then in 2007, and the fourth one being scheduled for this June. Information to go out to tribal members soon, so watch for that in your tribal newspaper and elsewhere. And I've worked in language reclamation for a long time. It's what I specialize in my academic work. And I've noticed certain things about language programs, and to an extent, I think that a lot of goals, articulated objectives, that center on the notion of language proficiency or linguistic proficiency. For example, people say things such as learners will become fluent, or learners will be able to carry out a conversation, or learners will be able to perform blank, like say a prayer or greet somebody or something to that effect in the language. Learners will know X number of words in the language. And all of these, of course, are very reasonable goals, but they're focusing on language specifically, the ability to say things or to say something in a certain context. Important, of course, but we have to ask, is this really what language reclamation is all about? Is this the goal, or is this the outcome? There's a less commonly articulated goal, so I put it in red text here. This is always my personal one, it still is. That learners will know that their language is not primitive. Sort of a proficiency in linguistics, if you will. It's the basic tenet of linguistic theory, that all languages are equal in their expressive potential, not necessarily in how they structure things grammatically or the specific set of words that they might happen to have at any given point, but equal in the expressive potential, the ability to create words to express new ideas, and so on. This one is always of special importance to me because of a quotation, one that you've seen before if you've been to any of my presentations, because I have a way of working it in somehow. I don't even need to read it anymore, or I don't need to look at it. Vocabulary of the Miamis was not very great, probably containing not over 600 or 800 words, but it was all they needed in their savage life. They possibly used no more than 100 words in common conversation. The language is very imperfect, as one might suppose. The noun, the verb, and the adjective were about the only parts of speech used. And the great irony of this, aside from the fact that it's outright false, is that the Miami language, in a very technical sense, does not have adjectives. If you're a technical linguist, you might notice that, but this is from 1961. It was not that long ago. Just a couple of days ago, I was looking at a book about the Peoria tribe, a book from 1991, in which a similar statement appeared, not so much about the language, but about American Indians in general. It said Indians were savages. This is from 1991. So why are these things important? In many cases, this is what children are learning in school. So yes, I mean, being able to say a certain thing, to be able to say a prayer, to be fluent, or to be conversationally proficient, yes, all of those things may be important. They may be outcomes. But in some cases, this is what we're working with. But going back to those basic linguistically oriented goals, the ones that we have to an extent moved away from in the Myaamia community, there are a number of pitfalls. One is that language revitalization success may be overly evaluated with respect to higher goals. For example, we have a camp. The goal, the articulated goal, is some sort of linguistic fluency. Are people fluent after a one-week camp? No, of course not. Does that mean that the camp failed? These higher goals require intergenerational, long-term efforts. The success in many, many programs is too often measured by the here and now. All of these sorts of goals are linguistic, the ones that I've already articulated, but the reasons for having them in the first place usually revolve around something much larger. Community and cultural issues, issues of bad information being passed on, colonization, efforts to Americanize, to kill the Indian, save the man. That quotation that so many of us have heard and internalized over the years. Keeping all of this in mind, I want to argue that language goals must not only be appropriate to the type and length of the revitalization activity. For example, if it's a one-week camp, they have to be revolving around a one-week activity. But they also must be situated in terms of larger community and cultural efforts. Most importantly, the context, the larger social context in which any kind of language camp, language program happens to exist, must always be considered, because that's what we're really responding to. So keeping that in mind, then, I want to share with you a few slides that I've used in my teaching, primarily at Berkeley, that I think show the type of context in larger society. And of course, this may not be the case at a Miami tribal gathering. It may not be the case here at the MyaamiakiConference. But I'm thinking about Miami children who are going through, in many cases, public schools, who are seeing certain images, who turn on mainstream TV, see certain things, and also miss certain things. So let's take a look. Far Side's a good cartoon. To begin, I'd like to show you this. Isn't it a beaut? New York, 1626. Chief of the Manhattan Indians addresses his tribe for the last time. What is this? What is this a parody of? And it's interesting, not only have we heard this story of the sale of Manhattan, but people also have a specific dollar amount, $24, and sometimes we hear 26, but there's this basic idea of a ridiculous sum of money, the stupid Indian who doesn't understand the value of land, who doesn't even understand private ownership, even though in our language, in Miami language, certain things seem to be grammaticized, that is, they're part of the grammar, and that things that are actually owned by somebody, that are part of them, say words like knife, take a different grammatical structure than things that may be associated with somebody but not necessarily owned by them. I often bring this image up to classes or to groups that I talk to, and then I'll pose the question, can anybody name any other agreement between a European power and an indigenous nation? For the sake of time, I'm not going to go around the room here, but what often happens is that people will recognize this image and they'll know the story, and that'll be the only one that they know. Sometimes if they think about it, they may think of a few others. I'm not sure I have the lingo down, but I think they're inviting us to a feast called a casino, where they have slots, craps, and blackjack. These images are out there. I like to use Craigslist a lot. Actually, it comes out of the San Francisco Bay Area, a forum where people can post things, say to sell things or to advertise an apartment, something like that. One that's spread around the United States and around the world. In fact, I understand it's relatively widely used here in southwestern Ohio. This is from the San Francisco Bay Area Craigslist, again, a forum that anybody can post to. And somebody in the rants and raves section asked, this is the title of their posting, "Have you ever seen an Indian in an Indian casino?" Me neither. I went to Cache Creek, it's a tribal casino in California, to pull a few slots. My first time won $264, had fun, but guess what? No Indians. I asked the cashier, where are the Indians? He So they didn't have any. Now what is that all about? There's a certain image people have of what an Indian is supposed to look like. We go into, you can't look around and tell if they're Indians or not, unless you happen to know the people who are in the room, you happen to know that they are. That would be different. But you can't tell because it's not, there isn't a given image, and yet people very much have one. See, somebody neglected to buy their outfit. Only $14.99 plus shipping for a Native American boy. We know what Indians are supposed to look like, right? And we learn about it in school. We get our name tags, and our paper feathers. I'm reminded of when I was in kindergarten. We had a Thanksgiving feast, and half the class were Indians, the other half were pilgrims. I was a pilgrim. And we had these ridiculous black paper hats, and the Indians had the ridiculous 2 paper feathers. These are the images that our people learn in school, and not just in school, but also elsewhere. Begs the question again, what are Indians supposed to look like? Amy Mowry addressed this very well this morning. In fact, it's appropriate that she's in this image. See a lot of different people there, look a lot of different ways, and everybody in that image is Miami. This is the 2007 youth camp. So that said, keeping all of these things in mind, this importance of having pride in one's culture, of knowing the basic facts about one's culture, what used to be language-based goals sort of switched into a larger community context. Now in our language programs, language is taught within a cultural community context where it has a natural place. Specific language objectives are lower on the list of goals. So things like somebody will be able to say this. Of course it's important because you need to be able to say things, but that's not the main point. We evaluate success comprehensively, partly with respect to language knowledge and use, but also with an eye to its effects on the strength of the overall community. That is, for any given program, what are people taking away from that? Not just linguistically, but in terms of larger issues. For the A1 Zapata program in particular, we've articulated learning objectives such as these. You notice, I say with the 4th bullet, build a sense of community responsibility. Above that, experience having a task or responsibility. Above that, build, reinforce, and or articulate kinship. Language is in there, but it's not overshadowing the other ones. And in fact, here we have some documentary filmmakers who were doing some filming of our first camp, interviewing some of the participants about their experience. And almost invariably, people would talk about wanting to teach their siblings Myaamia, or in some cases wanting to go to McDonald's or to a store and order something in Myaamia, just for the sake of it. Or how they were going to, in this case, they were going to tell their grandmother about their experience because she was really excited that they were attending this camp. So we've had a lot of feedback of that kind. But we've also moved into more formal assessment. This is what I want to talk about next. We started with feedback from the camp staff, interviews of participants. This past summer, we started the pilot program having a pre-camp and post-camp survey, a questionnaire of sorts, where people would answer questions, opinion-based answers, as well as some basic demographic facts, name, age, and so on, internet access, for purposes of sending out materials. And we're moving then to something a little bit larger. My hypothesis is that the participants who go through these activities then are going to be the leaders of the tribe. They're already taking on leadership roles. They're going to be the future leaders of the tribe. And I'm going to track that more formally. But in the meantime, I'm going to talk about these pre-camp and post-camp surveys, as well as in terms of some of their interesting results. So this is what the survey looked like. They're both 4 pages long. This is a pre-camp survey for student participants. You'll notice it says number 1, Kiwanzuna, and then it says your name. Of course, the pre and the post-camp surveys are different in that the pre-camp survey has a lot more English in it. So in the post-camp, it just says it in Myaamia, and that's appropriate. So let me give you an example here. Both the pre and post-camp survey had a question on whether the participant likes to eat traditional Miami foods. Of course, the questions were not worded exactly the same because, as I was saying, the post-camp survey had a lot more Miami language in it. For the pre-camp responses, and 50% represented there in blue, saying yes, ihia, I do like to eat traditional foods. And then 25% each for no, I don't, or I'm not sure. Post-camp then, you could say that the traditional food likers represented a larger part of the pie. Not to make a stupid pun, but it kind of works. Yeah. 17 out of 20 saying yes, I do. One person saying no, which is okay. We have diversity in our community. Not everybody has to like everything. And a couple of people saying, I'm not sure. But this is just one of many, many examples of how people can learn over the course of a week and experience things. Experiencing actually cooking the food. In some cases, planting the plants. Serving the food. Naming it in a Myaamia way, using the Miami names. Speaking of names, this term Ewan Zapata has been coming up throughout the day, and I've been using it, but we haven't actually said what it means. I'd like to rectify that. Pre-camp, we had a question. Do you know what the name of the camp, Ewan Zapata, means? Only 4 out of 20 participants, or 20 respondents, said ihia, yes, that they did. 16 out of 20 said no. Post-camp, we were up to 75%, 15 out of 20 participants correctly indicating that the term means sunrise, or otherwise refers to the sun rising. It's also cognate to our word for east. Tim McCoy was talking this morning about how Myaamia, or word for noon, related to a word for south, and how that reflects the specific geographical location of Miami lands, at least historically. Now with the east, I think anywhere we went in the world, this would still work, because the sun always rises in the east, regardless of what hemisphere you happen to be in. So we went from 4 out of 20 to 15 out of 20. This sort of begs the question of why we didn't get 20 out of 20, but we'll work on that next time. The other slides were saying things like family, relationship, nice ideas, but not the exact lexical meaning of this particular term. They were capturing the themes of the camp, for sure. From the post-camp survey, 2007, do you plan to use Myaamia language at home after this camp? 18 out of 20, overwhelmingly saying ihia, yes. And 2 out of 20 saying that they weren't sure, but nobody's saying no. Also, with any kind of survey, I always like to include some sort of bigger picture question. This one we worded a little bit differently. And this theme also came up earlier today, this idea of being Miami Indian versus being Myaamia. I think it's appropriate that we had this transgression even within the week and even within our own paperwork. Pre-camp, we asked everybody to write as much as they wanted. They had a whole page they could fill in. What does it mean to be a Miami Indian? Post-camp, what does it mean to be Myaamia? Of course, with 20 different participants, you would expect at least 20 different answers, and a lot of diversity even for one person, because this is a loaded concept. It's not that it means any one specific thing, but there are certain themes that will likely come up, or that did come up. So I want to share some of those with you. Pre-camp thoughts. This first one is very interesting. She's getting a lot of influence from her mother, but see this sitting here. It means that you may know more things that other people think are right about the Miami Indians and may not really be true at all. That's some good education. But that was an outlier. 2 people explicitly and specifically said, I don't know. One person responded, that's what I'm here to learn. And that's a great reason to attend, right? But the question then becomes, well, what did they learn throughout the week? So here's some post-camp thoughts. What does it mean to be Myaamia? To be Myaamia, you have to know your language and also to be involved in your community. The community is what we take care of day in and day out. means that we all work together and learn more of our Myaamia language and to do our games and eat more of our food. See, there's a food theme. To work together and be a community, celebrate our traditions. To be friendly, nice, loyal. We are special by being Myaamia. We have our own culture and own language. That theme came up a lot. Living with our culture, language, and each other. Each other is the key point there. Family came up again and again and again in a lot of the responses. One way or another, some allusion to family. That kinship and relationship were major themes of this last camp, of all of them, but especially of this last one. This is from a language lesson. It's one of the few times that we actually were outright teaching language. Most of the time the language was learned through use, through other activities. This was an exception in that we actually wrote a few words on a whiteboard. Nila, myself, me, in the center then. And then the various people who are related to me in different ways surrounding that. Participants learn this vocabulary and then put it through use through a series of exercises. This past summer, we asked the participants to bring in pictures of their Myaami relatives. Here they are, laid out onto a table. And then each participant made some sort of a poster himself on the theme, Nila Myaamia, I am Miami. And you'll notice in this particular one, I don't know if you can see it from this end, you can pretend. We have some recent pictures and some youth on the right. We have an older black and white picture on the left. And so often in these sorts of situations, you only see the black and white photo because Indians are people of the past, or supposedly people of the past. And so this is a nice mix. It shows where we come from, but also who we're related to today. It was all part of rebuilding the community web. For those of you who've seen the video documentary shown last night, or if you haven't seen it, you will see it eventually. You'll have access to that eventually. At our first camp, and in fact at all of the camps, there's been an exercise where people have taken some thread, thrown it around in a circle, where each person will then hold on to their piece, and it forms a web. And what happens then is that when a couple of people let go, the web still works, the community is still there. But once a lot of people start letting go, so we start losing language, or culture, or spirituality, or whatever it may be, then it all falls apart. However, if people go in and then pick up those pieces again and pull them tight again, the web comes back. This is represented in an image, Kiluna Myaamiaki, We Are Miamis, in which we featured the names of all the camp participants, and then drew lines to show the other participants to whom they were related. A lot of people met relations they realized, that people that they did not realize they were related to. And that's very, very powerful, right? Because they're not going to walk on their relatives' backs, not in a bad way anyway. So there we have, again, rebuilding the web quite literally. To me, as I was reviewing the responses to that final question, what does it mean to be Myaamia? There's one in particular that really stood out to me. It's from Hunter Mullen, who's been participating in the language activities for a number of years, both workshops as well as in the camps. And I see her being a staff member in the future, because that's how the natural succession happens. She wrote, I think that it's important to be Myaamia because when we get older and our elders pass away, we could be able to teach kids younger than us how to speak our language, so then they can pass it down, generation to generation. I think it is very important to be Myaamia and to be able to speak it. It's that theme of knowledge being responsibility, knowledge entailing responsibility. You see that coming through here. And this, the theme was there throughout the camp. The theme is always there throughout our workshops. But this is not something that we're outright saying. We're not telling people to say this. This is something that they're coming up with on their own. They're internalizing these values. So Hunter, who made this statement, is there on the left. You're grinding Miami corn. And she, in fact, did teach somebody younger than her. They're on the right. Father's here in the back. All right, so she was picking up on that responsibility right away. Not yet an elder, arguably, but she will be someday. Speaking of elders, however, the people who are already elders also continue to play a very, very important role in all of our language activities, our language camps. This past year, we started an elder evening where elders gathered and kind of talked about their life experiences, and of course were gifted then with things that the camp participants had made. So here we just have a very nice picture of Pauline and Nadine. This is an activity that we're definitely going to continue every year. Here's another one, and this one, of course, is a somewhat sad picture that my grandfather took who has since passed away. I certainly didn't expect that as of June of last year. It's really getting at the heart of what Hunter was saying, is that when people pass on then, it needs to be somebody else to have that knowledge, to have that wisdom, then to pass it on to others. It's part of the cycle. Finally, then, that begs the question, well, is the A1 Zapata program successful? You notice I didn't talk too much about actual language use or proficiency. Now, certainly people did learn a lot of words. They were speaking in Miami, they were addressing each other in Miami, they were filling out surveys that had questions that were only in Miami. That part's working. We'll hear more about intergenerational efforts and home efforts later on this afternoon. But more generally, is the A1 Zapata, the Sunrise program, successful? I'm going to say yes. Ihya. Make it a little bigger, just to emphasize it. In closing here, I want to share with you one other post-camp survey question. This is one that's closer to my own work and is a follow-up of what I presented 2 years ago at the second biennial Myaamia conference, when I talked about the notion of language extinction, of how languages like Miami get termed extinct even though they really aren't, and how I see that as a problem. That I feel that extinct languages are those that are irretrievably lost, those that don't exist in documentation and that nobody claims heritage to. Arguably the vast majority of languages that ever existed in human history, but definitely not Miami. So we asked them, or actually I asked them, to respond to the following statement. Myaamia is an extinct language. Now note that we did not talk about language extinction during the camp itself, at least not in any large-scale explicit way. Rather, we just used the language. We just spoke to each other. We just did Miami things. The results are somewhat interesting. Ihya, yes, Miami is extinct, 0 out of 20. Smarter than some of the people in academia. Many. No offense, many. Motsit, no, 18 out of 20, 90%. And finally, a couple of people saying that they weren't sure. It's the best way to show the language is not extinct, by using it. When people go into their schoolrooms or elsewhere, come across their friends, they see these silly Indian images, the plains headdress, not that there's something wrong with that, but it happens not to be Miami. When they read in a book that Miami is a very primitive language, it's only 600 to 800 words, they can think, well, gee, we use more than that. They can't. The dictionary itself has a lot more than that. Where are these people coming from? When people say to them, your language is extinct, your culture is extinct, the real Miamis are in the past, people can say, well, no, I mean all my relations, the people I knew at camp. So I think the camp is very, very successful because it's fostering those relationships, creating a situation that the community can be healthy, people can be effective leaders in the future. This one I like to think of as an exam question where it's good to get a 0. 0 out of 20, it's an A+. On that note then, we'll end with a word that the Baldwin children taught me, Eyingi, that I understand means something to the effect of the end. And I bid you Mishine with big thanks. Y'all on my minutes? Yeah. For questions? Any questions? We've already heard a lot about the camp and will continue to do so because so many people here have been involved in one way or another. Yes?
Hey Wes, thanks for the presentation. It seems like you were leaning more towards sort of the pragmatic angle on your analysis. Could you maybe speak a little bit? I suspect you have more of kind of a scholarly interest as well in the camp and analyzing the data. Could you speak a little bit towards that aspect?
Well, it's a sort of a conundrum. So the question about scholarly interest, and the fact of the matter is that language programs, camps, cost a lot of money, take a lot of time, takes a tremendous amount of time, say even with the traditional foods, that were, where dinners were entirely traditional foods. That was something where our food consultants were researching ahead of time, practicing ahead of time, trying out recipes ahead of time. Developing the lessons took weeks and weeks and weeks, each one with specific objectives. So all of those things. And we've enjoyed tremendous support in the Myaamia community from our tribal leadership, particularly in terms of funding these sorts of endeavors and understanding their importance in a larger context. But I've seen many communities where that's not the case, where people really have to fight for these things. And so in a scholarly sense, in terms of my academic work, I feel a need to quantify these things just a little bit more, even though that isn't my particular style, to show, in an unambiguous way, that these sorts of efforts really, really pay off in the long run. So that's one thing. And secondly, I see a lot of communities that are going through the same stages that we went through in ours, and that their first initial focus is on language. And then all these other things eventually come about later. And so I'd eventually like to write some sort of a book that talks about language reclamation efforts and brings in all these sorts of things, but then intersperses those discussions with things like economic development and education of things other than language and eating foods and all of those things. Just get the idea across that you really can't talk about one without talking about the other. A couple of ideas. I'd like to bring this into my teaching. Yeah, Bill.
The evaluation of the impact of language reclamation on community, is that, and I'm not, maybe Daryl can answer this as well, is that recognized in ANA category, what was it, category 2 grants in terms of the success of the grant program?
Which one does the one? Do you remember?
Not specifically, only hearsay.
Yeah, I'd have to check on that. Could I get back to you?
Yeah, well, my sense is that I haven't looked at these for a while, but my sense was that this is outside of the, it shouldn't be, but the impact on community and revitalization and so on is central, but actually it may be periphery to the way in which they construct those grants.
There's so many grants, government, United States government specific. Of course, there are lots of governments within the United States government specifically. Again, revolve around that here and now.
Right.
We have this one-year program, what comes out of it at the end, and that makes it very, very hard to show the success for something that intrinsically is a long-term endeavor. We see those statements made about how preschool then helps somebody in kindergarten, and kindergarten, going to a good kindergarten, helps them in elementary school, and then that helps them in middle school, and then high school and college, and so on. And we're able to have access to that sort of information because those people are tracked longitudinally. So again, get back to the earlier question, one role I see myself taking then is to do that in a more objective, if you will, way to be able to make that claim. Yeah, with the Administration for Native Americans grant, especially the initial one that the Myaami Tribe of Oklahoma received, I, to be frank, am amazed that we did, because those things are tremendously biased against languages that are extinct, and somehow we were able to do it anyway. So I think that really says a lot for Karen Alexander and others who were involved in the initial process.
Did the tribe have a category 1? Category 1 which was the status of the language. The status. Did you have a category 2 after that?
I have to look back at the initial paperwork.
The other thing I noticed, and I wrote one of these grants for another nation, but I was struck by the fact, I mentioned this to Daryl before, that even though that there is a federal government official recognition of the precarious nature of indigenous languages, that ANA grants are put on a competitive footing, which pits nation against nation, which I find to be absolutely outrageous. But
there are different ideas. The brief background is that the United States government in 1990 officially changed its stance towards indigenous languages, saying that it will be the policy of the United States to preserve, protect, and promote indigenous languages. That was followed up with a very limited amount of funding a little bit later that nations or other entities could apply for. These are 3-year programs. And there's been an effort to increase the funding and also to look for longer-term programs. I think whatever's there is better than nothing, but I really see the goal to all of this is for self-determination, for the tribes to have economic ventures and other things that will allow them or allow us to get away from that, because we can't rely on it. They're a way to get started.
Yeah.
Wes, I think you mentioned that one of the measures of success was that you couldn't accept all the applicants for the camp. And so I was wondering, is the rate limiting step financial, logistical, or is there some, carrying capacity that just is an optimal size for the camp?
All of the above. We have had to start turning people away. Not very many, but a few, and that's a potential problem. And the language committee discussed this with the business committee just yesterday. We may need to have 2 camps. We don't want to turn people away. We don't want to turn people away. But there is an issue of wanting it to be very high quality. We want to make sure that the counselor participant ratio is relatively low. There can be a lot of bonding, a lot of supervision, except for all this is the camp. And the idea that if it gets too big at any one given time, then those sorts of personal interactions may not be as able to happen. So we're right around the 20 to 25 range right now. That works pretty well. As the need gets larger, as more funding and other things become available, I think what we would do is to go to 2 camps, probably rather than making this one very large. But yes, it's great, but it's also unfortunate, right? It is a measure of success in that people want to come, but what we do. Fortunately, it hasn't been too big of a problem. It's like we're almost out of time. Do we have time for one more question?
It was more of a comment. You shared that really rich quotation from the young girl who talked about the importance of passing on language to future generations, and here she is as a child. But it's the last line that really jumped out at me. She said, I think it's important to be Myaamia and to be able to speak it. And I was thinking about that because I don't think that one should take that to separate being Myaamia from speaking the Miami language. And you could read it to be speaking a state of being. Speaking one's sense of self as Myaamia. And when you talk about measures of success, to have a child not distinguish a sense of being from the language one speaks is quite remarkable.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I'd also mention that in the pre-camp survey, and I didn't talk about this in the presentation, we had a question about what language is for. Why would people learn a language? And people tended to have communication-oriented answers. Good to learn this language because then you go to that country and you can use it. It helps you get a job, that sort of thing. And we saw a real shift over the course of the week. So, but again, I think that the value of that and how these things are intertwined. Now, language is part of that identity, but not really separable. That's going to come out more this afternoon. So. Yeah. And I apologize for the echoing.